Hi, I'm Ferengian, and this is my Chainmail Ring Making 101 video. I love doing mail work, talking about mail work, and teaching people how to do mail work. Occasionally it's easier to show how something's done than try to explain it with words, and making rings is definitely one of those things. So today we're going to talk about how to make rings for basic butted link chainmail. There are other types, soldered and welded and riveted. They all use basically the same technique for cutting the rings. It's just that the others will add some more steps in the process. If somebody wants to see how to make those, they can either adapt from what's here, or if somebody asks very nicely in the comments section, we can make a follow-on video. So let's get started. I like my students to know how to make rings so they can understand the process, and in case they need to fabricate rings of some unusual material or odd size. But let's face it, after 10,000 or so rings, you'd probably rather spend your time making projects than making rings. To start off, let's talk about our materials. Today we're working with some 12-gauge copper round wire. The techniques will work with pretty much any metal, gauge, or shape of wire you want to work with. Next, let's take a look at our tools. They're actually pretty simple. You can make it more complex if you want to. You can even invest in ring-making power tools. But if you really need that many rings, it may be time to go ahead and buy rings from a company. Our basic tools include a mandrel, something to wrap the wire around. You generally want a piece of metal that's the size and shape of the inside space for your ring. You could use wood, but it breaks down a lot faster. I've got a big nail that's the right diameter for the inside of the rings we'll be making today. I've cut off the point and drilled a hole so we can slip the wire into the mandrel. You could use a slot rather than a hole, but I feel the hole holds the wire more securely than a slot would. We also want a handle for our mandrel. It makes it easier to work with. I use this little vice grip. Next, we need something to cut the wire with. There are cutters like these that will snip the rings off. If you want to go that route, you want the right cutter for your wire. Cutters are rated for the gauge of wire and for soft or hard metals. If you're trying to cut big steel wire with these little cutters, you're more likely to kill your tool than have a good easy cut. Cutters come as a sort of generic bevel cutter, or in flush or super flush. These terms refer to how flat or pinched the end of the wire will be after you've made your cut. The super flush cutters leave the flattest end, and the bevel cutters leave the most pinch. But the bevel cutters are also more resistant to damage and can usually handle bigger wire than the flush or super flush cutters. If you really want smooth, parallel sides on your ring, which you do if you're soldering, welding, or making jewelry, then the best way to cut rings is with a saw. This jeweler's saw is something to get to know if you're serious about metalwork. It makes the best ring edges and is useful for a lot of other fine metal and woodworking projects. Naturally, you don't get something for nothing. Cutting rings with a jeweler's saw is harder work than snipping, and you need to learn to use the saw well. There are whole books on that subject alone. There are setups that you can get to cut rings with a mini motor or flux shaft machine. Don't try this without something to contain the rings. They will fly. Again, this is a point where you want to do a little bit of thinking. Is it worth a little bit more money, or is it worth your time and sanity? Once you've learned the process, cutting your own rings may save you a fraction of a cent per ring, but I'd really rather spend my time working on projects. Last but not least, we may want to polish our rings. Keep your rings away from buffers, even the little one on your micromotor. Rings tend to fly, and we're not trying to make bullets. The best way to polish rings is with a tumbler. This is the setup that I use. A 3-pound double-barrel tumbler with steel shot. Tumble polishing is another one of those things that's a whole subject of its own, and really worthy of its own video. The main thing we need to know for now is that you would load the rings in the barrel with steel shot, water, and an appropriate tumbling chemical, and let it run for an hour or so. If you want a tumble polishing video, that would be a great thing to leave a comment about. You could also check my YouTube channel to see if I've got that one done yet. One problem you will run into in metalwork is work hardening of the metal. With what we're going to be doing, work hardening is definitely a problem that we're going to be concerned about. What work hardening means is that as we work with the wire, it will get harder or more resistant to being moved and shaped. Sometimes that's a good thing. You want your finished piece to resist scratching and bending. But while we're working, work hardening is a problem. The solution to work hardening is a process called annealing. If your metal is reasonably workable, you don't need to worry about annealing right now. We can do that later. If your metal is hard to bend, you might want to anneal it before you start making rings. I have 2 videos that walk you through the details of annealing for both ferrous and non-ferrous metals. For now, you need to know that as you work with your wire, it will harden, which is a good thing in the long run. But if you still need to work with your wire, you may need to pause and do some annealing so your metal doesn't crack and break. Okay, we're going to start the process of making our rings. And to start, you're going to slip the end of your wire into the end of your mandrel. If you're using one like I do, which has a hole instead of a slot, you want to make this first piece a little bit higher so you got something that you can snip off when you're taking it off the mandrel. We're going to just wrap it around, slow and steady, trying to make as nice a coil as we can. If you are doing heavier wire like steel or bronze, you can actually get a halfway decent workout doing this stuff. You know, not a big bodybuilder workout, but you can definitely get a little bit of arm strength out of this. When we get to the end of our coil here, we stop, get out our cutters, and snip here, and take off our coil. And I got him a little bit too tight on this one, but that's not a problem. Now, I get questions on how long to make the coil. This one's actually kind of short. A lot of times, I like to make the coil about the length of my mandrel because that works for me. And I think the real answer is you make a coil that's long enough to be worthwhile for the number of rings you need to make, but short enough that it's not going to be a pain to work with. You know, if you have a 6-foot long coil, that's going to be a problem to cut. Okay, through the magic of video, we have our coil that has now been annealed and ready. And we have some cutters that are of the appropriate size. You don't want anything too big or too small for your rings. The black handled cutters that I showed you earlier, I use those for steel because these guys just would not cut that. But those cutters can get in the way if you are cutting smaller size rings, so you have to make a judgment call. You line up at a good spot on your coil and start cutting rings. It is a good idea to wear eye protection because things do occasionally go flying and you don't want to put your eye out. You also want to make your cuts as close together. I like to run the edge for the next one right up against where I was for the first one. Now, you will notice that these cutters don't make really nice ends on the ring. You actually do better to saw your rings. Sawing the rings will create a better end, and we're going to go and show you how to do that in just a second here. Okay, if you're going to saw the rings, it helps a lot of times to actually wrap this coil in some masking tape, because you want to cut rings. You don't want to send rings all over your workshop. Today I'm not going to do that so that we can see a little bit better what we're doing with the coil, but it might be a good idea. And this is one of my little homemade bench pins. I actually have some nicer professional made ones, but this is the one I'm using at the moment. This is a sacrificial thing, which means we can cut on it, drill on it, whatever we want to, and it helps us make stuff. And the V is cut into it to help us saw things, so we will rest the coil here in the notch of the V. You could do this with a vise also. I'm fairly used to using my bench pin, so that's what I use. Now we've got our jeweler's saw, and we're going to lubricate the blade before we cut anything with it, because you break blades if you don't. And then we bring our coil into the notch, and we start cutting with our saw blade. And remember, you want to cut at an angle because we're making rings, not half moons. And you want to be able to cut the top of the ring without sawing through the bottom. And just keep going until you got as many rings as you need. Once we've got the supply of rings we need, it's time to polish or work on our project. How many rings to cut at one time really depends on how many you need for the project. If you're polishing rings, you might also consider the working capacity of your polishing setup. I've seen tumblers that would go from a quarter cup of rings to several quarts, liters for you metric types. Whatever your chosen next step is, if you follow this process, congratulations. You've made your own rings for chainmail. Check out my other metalworking videos on my YouTube channel. I've also got a chainmail book coming out on Amazon in April 2016, so check that out if you don't have it yet. For more information about me, Varangian, check out my blog at wordsmeanstuff.wordpress.com.